Hello, and welcome to this first lesson from our new series, which will be looking at the book of Exodus. The title for the series is The Story of a People. And this particular lesson, coming from Exodus chapter 2, is entitled God Plans Deliverance. First, let's talk a little bit about the background of Egypt. Egypt is sometimes referred to as the gift of the Nile. Now, the Nile River is that river which flows from the middle of the continent of Africa northwards towards the Mediterranean Sea. We're told that that river actually is 4,180 miles in length. One writer observed that this was equivalent to 1/6 of the circumference of the earth. Egypt is referred to as the gift of the Nile because Egypt was originally formed there at the mouth of the Nile, where the Nile River ran into the Mediterranean Sea and then extended southward and extended as far south as the first group of rapids, which is called a cataract. The land on each side of the Nile River was very fertile, and it would flood every year in the rainy season. And as it would flood, it would water the land. So the land was a very fertile agricultural area, thus the name, the gift of the Nile. When we think of Egypt, we normally think of the pyramids. Now, we don't necessarily think about the antiquity of the nation of Egypt. But let me put this in perspective. When Joseph and his brothers arrived in Egypt, the pyramids had already been in existence for 500 years. That's something we don't always think about. But this is an ancient country that was very, very advanced in its civilization early on. And the building of the pyramids is evidence of that in that very early day. The nation of Egypt was ruled by several different dynasties, if you will, several different families. The king of Egypt was usually referred to as the Pharaoh. There were times when the folks who had been there the longest were ruling, and then there were people who moved in from the outside and they took over and would rule, and then the families that had been living there that had lost power, they would regain power. So you had a turnover in the dynasties of the pharaohs throughout the history of Egypt. It was thought that the Hyksos family or dynasty was in power when Jacob moved his family to Egypt. Now, the Hyksos were outsiders. They were originally Semitic people, having moved in from the north and the east. Now, by saying they were Semitic, it means they came from the same group of people as the Hebrews came from, for the Hebrews were Semitic people as well. This is why some believe that the Pharaoh was maybe a little more favorable to Joseph and Jacob when they moved the family in at that period of time. We also know that the Hyksos at some point in time lost power, and one of the families who were more indigenous to the area took power and therefore were not as favorable to the Semitic Hebrews as maybe the Hyksos had been. In fact, Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 mentions that a new king came to the throne and he did not know of Joseph, suggesting maybe that with this new dynasty change, these people were not Semitic in their background, therefore they were not as sympathetic to the Hebrews as the Hyksos might have been. We know from reading the book of Genesis that Egypt was very much a part of the Hebrew world at that time. We know that Abraham went to Egypt when they didn't have, when there was a famine there in the Promised Land. We know that God made a promise to Abraham that in fact his children would one day live in that Promised Land, but that before then they were going to be taken into a foreign country. In Exodus chapter 15, verses 13 through 14, God promised, "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. So there was a promise all the way back to Abraham's time that eventually the Hebrews, the Israelites, would be delivered from Egypt. And of course, the book of Exodus is all about that deliverance. But God made a similar promise to Jacob, Genesis 46, 3 and 4. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you and surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. So we can see that the book of Genesis has laid the groundwork for the Exodus that's described in the book of Exodus and that we're going to be looking at. That is, the book of Genesis raised up a new people, Abraham and his descendants. By the time of Jacob, there were about 70 of them, and that family or clan moved into Egypt at the end of Genesis. And now, some 400 years later, just as God had promised Abraham, we have the setting for the book of Exodus. Now, as I said, there were, the scriptures tell us there were 70 of Jacob's family that went down to Egypt. 400 years later, when they come out, the question is, how many were there that came out of Egypt? And the scriptures say that there were 600,000, not counting women and children. Now, if you take women and children and add it to it, the commentaries say that they would suggest that there would have been as many as 2 million Hebrews that came out of Egypt. That has been under serious debate. Some people, many scholars challenge that number, suggesting that that was not possible to have that many people come out of this one family of 70, and that it was not probable that 2 million people would be moving along through the 40 years of the wilderness, as the book, as the Bible describes. Some suggest that the word that is translated there as 600,000, that word should be translated as chiefs. So they say there were 600 chiefs, heads of families, if you will. And they speculate that that means there was probably 6,000 men plus women and children. Whether the critics are right, or whether we take that literally at 600,000 men plus women and children, I'll leave to you. But we understand that while Joseph and his family, his brothers and his family were in Egypt, they did do just as God instructed. They settled in, they multiplied, and they grew in number. Now, we understand, though, from the scriptures, that the new Pharaoh was afraid of their large number. Now, whether he would have been afraid of 6,000 or not, I'm not sure. But he was afraid of their large number, and his fear was that if Egypt was attacked, these folks would turn to the enemy and help the enemy defeat Egypt. Or, another scenario, these folks would leave, and they provided a significant portion of the workforce, leaving Egypt without a workforce. So the 600,000 sounds very fitting to those fears, whereas the 6,000 may not be fitting to those fears or appropriate for those fears. Bottom line is, what has happened, we're told there in the scriptures, is that the new king, the new Pharaoh comes on the throne. He's afraid of the numbers of Hebrews, and so he sets a plan in motion. The first plan was, he tells the midwives who were delivering the Hebrew children to kill every male child that was born. But we know these midwives didn't do that. So in response, he issued an order that all male Hebrew infants were to be thrown into the Nile River. And that is the order that's in place as we begin our lesson today, looking in chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. So let's read a couple of verses out of chapter 2 in the book of Exodus. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. This is seemingly an ordinary story. This seems to be, so what? A Levite man, meaning he is Hebrew, meaning he can trace his lineage back to Jacob's son Levi, married a woman of the same tribe, and she conceives, and they have a son. We don't know exactly what the Israelites, 400 years after they've been living in Egypt, how much they were teaching their children about Israelite promises. Let's put it this way: there's nothing that's stated, but the story, as the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly aware that they had maintained their identity, and they had recited the promises that their ancestors had received. It seems a very strong implication that mothers would tell their children about the promise to Abraham, that one day all the Hebrews would enjoy living in the promised land, that they knew the promise made to Jacob, that one day God was going to deliver them back to that land that he had promised to Abraham. It seems that they had maintained their identity, and although it doesn't state with particularity, with details, just the suggestion to say that he was a Levite man and married a Levite woman is suggesting that they are keeping their faithfulness to their lineage as children of Abraham, children of Levi, children of Jacob, children of Israel. So we're told that she has a baby. Now, we know from later verses that this man and woman already had 2 children. They had an older son, Aaron, and an older daughter, Miriam. Now, the passage here doesn't give us their names, the mom and dad's names. In chapter 6, verse 1, we're told that the name of Moses' father was Amram, and that his mother's name was Jochebed. But there are even questions about this because later on a different name is given to Joseph's father. So we're not told the details about what name, because that's not the significant thing. The significant thing here is a Levite man and woman have a child living in Egypt at a time when the king has ordered that every male child shall be thrown into the river. Interesting to note, verse 2 there. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, we're not real sure exactly what a fine child looks like. Over in Hebrews, the New Testament, the author to the Hebrews wrote this, chapter 11, verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Jewish tradition, history had been passed down so that by the time of the New Testament writing of the book of Hebrews, they understood that he was no ordinary child. He was a fine child. Whether that is because of special countenance, appearance, we're not real sure. Or whether they recognized him to be the fulfillment of the promise, we're not sure. Bottom line is, what we do know is that a Levite woman and Levite man marry, have a child, and they recognize him as being a fine child. Maybe a mother's instinct, her maternal instincts taken into place. But she sees he's a fine child. So what does she do? It says, when she could not hide him any longer, she hid him for 3 months. Because she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. That would give us an understanding of something of this mother's instinct. But it also tells us something of the mother's faith. For remember that verse I read to you out of Hebrews, the writer of the Hebrews says, it was by their faith that they hid him. By faith, Moses' parents hid him. In other words, they knew they were breaking the law, but they were willing to defy Pharaoh's order because they had the faith to believe. What was that faith? I'm suggesting to you. That faith was they knew of the promises that had been made to Abraham. They knew of the promises that had been made to Jacob. They anticipated God fulfilling those promises. They still served a God that they knew would keep his promise, and so it was their faith in his keeping his promise that they hid this child. They recognized this child to be no ordinary child. So they tried to hide him, and they hid him for 3 months. But then, verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the banks of the river Nile. When she can't hide him any longer. Now, what does that mean? Well, his crying, a 3-month-old crying in and of itself would be enough to alert the neighbors. If she's doing wash, her laundry would tell the neighbors. In other words, people would have to have known that their child had been born, and sooner or later they would find out it was a male child. So she hides him as long as she can, and then as an act of faith, she now takes the next step. She takes a papyrus basket. Now, the actual Hebrew word that is translated basket is only used one other time in the Old Testament. And in that setting, it was referring to Noah's ark. Now, there's a lot of difference between a basket and an ark. But the purpose of the basket was to be the same as that of the ark, God's plan of deliverance. So she takes this ark, if you will, made out of papyrus. Now, papyrus was a reed that grew along the edge of the Nile River. She took this basket, this container that's made out of these reeds, and she covered it with pitch and tar, this sticky, gooey stuff that would resist water, that would make it waterproof. And she made it into an ark, if you will. And then she placed the child in the basket. Then she took the basket and placed it in the edge of the river amongst the reeds. Now, as I said, there were reeds that grew along the edge of the Nile River. Why would she place it amongst the reeds? Maybe it was to keep the basket from floating out into the river proper, where the current would take it and wash the basket to the Red Sea. But it also may have been, this is implication, this is reading between the lines, it may have been that she knew that the Pharaoh's daughter would come down to the river to bathe, and that she thought that someone would find the basket if it was close enough to shore in the reeds there. So she places the basket in the river amongst the reeds, not told exactly in the scripture why, but seemingly for the purpose of it being found and not being washed away. God was planning a deliverance. And it seems that these two Levites were aware of God's plan, or had the faith to believe that God would deliver. And so they, in faith, placed this basket in the river, anticipating God is going to make the way. And just as we suspect that Jochebed would have known, what the Pharaoh's daughter does exactly what she had expected. First of all, we know that verse 4, his sister, Moses' sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Again, impliedly anticipating someone would find the child. Then the Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. The older sister's not named here. What we're told is the older sister was standing at a distance watching. This probably was the plan of Jochebed. This probably was the idea that they were anticipating the child would be fine. So she Miriam stands to the side, she watches, and then she sees the Pharaoh's daughter coming down to the river to bathe. Not uncommon for people to bathe in the river at that time, especially in Egypt, because the Nile River was worshipped. The Egyptians worshipped the river and thought the river's water to have special magical qualities, and that bathing in it would be good for your health and good for your skin. So it was not uncommon or unexpected that she would come down to bathe in the river. As she's bathing in the river, she sees the basket. She sends her attendants over to get the basket, and when they open the basket, she sees that it's a baby. And when this 3-month-old infant begins to cry, she feels sorry for him. Her maternal instincts have been aroused. One writer wrote it this way. He says, the child's tears went straight to the heart of the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, wait a minute. The Pharaoh's daughter knew what her father had ordered. All the male Hebrew children were to be killed. This child needed to be drowned. But the child's tears went straight to the heart of the daughter of the Pharaoh, reaching the common humanity that lies below all differences of race and creed, and she pitied him. How precise and exactly of all of the elements of this astounding narratives are dovetailed, synchronized, and fitted together. However incidental or accidental it may appear to have been, it all came about exactly as God had ordained. And those are the words of the commentator, Burton Kaufman. So God's plan is coming together. By faith, they put him in the river, and now she opens a basket, the baby cries, and she has pity on him. Now, when she opened the basket, she immediately identified him as a Hebrew child. The question may come, well, how would she know he's Hebrew? Well, as faithful Levites, it is reason to believe that his mom and dad had circumcised him at the 8th day, so the circumcision would have been a sign that he was a Hebrew. Now, the plan is yet to continue to unfold. Once she says this is a Hebrew child, then, verse 7, Moses' sister, asked the Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Now, this is kind of interesting here. Here is the Pharaoh's daughter. She goes down routinely to take a bath, sees the basket, opens it, recognizes it as a child, feels sorry for him because he's crying, and she knows there's a death order out. And then immediately, Miriam shows up. Now, it was seemingly in the humanness, the Pharaoh's daughter would be very surprised and taken that a Hebrew girl would approach her, the Pharaoh's daughter. And then more surprisingly, it would seem in the humanness, this girl says, do you want me to get a Hebrew woman to nurse the child? You would think that, number one, in the humanness, Pharaoh's daughter would have said, no, the child's going to be drowned. That's my father's order. But we're already told she's moved with compassion. She sees the baby crying. She feels sorry for him. So when Miriam comes up and surprisingly, unexpectedly, and says, do you want me to get someone to nurse the child for you? She, realizing that she wasn't able to nurse the child herself or care for the child herself, immediately responds, feeling sorry for the child. What am I getting at? God's working in the heart of even the Pharaoh's daughter? And she says, yes, yes. Now, she was taking a real risk. Her father's order was one thing, and she was contradicting her father's order. She was taking a real risk if she allowed this child to live. She was also taking a risk that if this child was given to a stranger, a Hebrew woman that she didn't know, child may never come back. And she evidently wanted the child because she's willing to take the risk with her dad, and she's taking a risk, may never get the child back. God's moving through all of these situations and predisposes her to say, yes, take the child and tell the mother, tell the woman that's going to nurse this child, I'll pay her. She says, yes, go, she answered, the daughter answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother, got Jochebed. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. Now you see, it seems that Pharaoh's daughter has every intention of this child coming back. She said, if you'll nurse the child, raise the child, I'll pay you, anticipating getting the child back. She's willing to take the risk. Very significant point here. So the woman, Jochebed, took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So Jochebed now goes to the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh's daughter, as I said, predisposed by prevenient grace, agrees that Jochebed will take the baby and nurse the baby, and she even agrees to pay Jochebed. We're told that happens. We're not given any details about what happens or how long the baby Moses is with Jochebed. We're only told that when he grew older. Now, the suggestion is that it probably meant that she nursed him until he was weaned. Now, question then becomes, how old would the child be then when he was weaned? In the custom of that day, we have reason to believe the child would have been about 3 years of age. There are situations where children were weaned earlier or later, but usually 3 years was the normal cultural expectation in that day and time. So let's accept 3 years. Jochebed, keeps the baby for 3 years. Now, let's understand the importance of that 3 years. In that 3 years, the child is in a very crucial time of attachment, a very crucial formation time in his life. And now we have this child who is Hebrew, who is being raised by these Levites who have enough faith in God to believe that this is no ordinary child, that they're willing to risk violating the king's order by placing the child in the basket. It would be expected then to have raised this child for his first 3 years, heavily steeped in the Hebrew tradition, which means they probably would have told him stories that came from their Hebrew faith. So for 3 years, in those very formative ways, they are teaching him to be a Hebrew. They are teaching him what it means to be a Hebrew. Then, when he's older, 3 or however, when he is older, she took the child back to Pharaoh's daughter. This was impliedly the agreement she had reached, and she took the child back to Pharaoh's daughter. And the scriptures simply say, and he, Moses, became her, the daughter's son. Now what that means is that Moses is basically adopted. He becomes accepted as part of the family. He becomes heir to the throne, which would mean he is going to receive the finest education that the palace can offer. Later on in the book of Acts, when Stephen is preaching that sermon just before he's executed, he, in telling the history of this story, says, Acts 7:22, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. So here he is being raised as an heir to the throne and receiving all the education and benefits that would come from living in the palace. And then we're told that because he is now the Pharaoh's daughter's son, she has the right to give him a name. And she names him Moses. Now, it's interesting. Surely Jochebed, Moses' father as well, had some name for him. We're never told that name. We're never told what name they gave him, what they called him for those 3 years. But Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. I drew him out of the water. The name Moses is an Egyptian word. One commentator says this. He said the Egyptian word for water is mo. The Egyptian word for rescued is Usus. So she gave him the name Mouses, which then later was translated into Moses. I drew him out of the water as the name. Additionally, the Egyptian word that was given to him as a name, Moses, is very, very similar in sound to the Hebrew word that means to bring forth or to draw out of. Another writer suggests that the Egyptian word for son is Mesus, which is similar to Moses. So he was given the name to Moses. The writer of the scripture says because Pharaoh's daughter intended to note that it was because he was drawn out of the river. I drew him out of the water. Well, let's look at verse 11 of chapter 2. One day after Moses had grown up. Now, do you see the lack of detail here? From the time he is probably 3 years of age, when Jochebed returns him to the Pharaoh's daughter, the concluding of verse 10. To the beginning of verse 11, we obviously have several years past. One day after Moses had grown up. How old was he when this happens? The Hebrew word that's translated had grown up usually refers to the age that one must be before he can choose to marry, choose his way of life, and participate in the family business. Now, what age is that? 18, 20, 25? He's an adult. He has grown up. One day, when he's grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Again, we don't know how old he was. But, now think about it with me. He was 3 years old, about some age young, when he was given to Jochebed to become the Pharaoh's grandson. He now spends the next 12, 15, 20 years being raised in the palace and educated in the palace as the Pharaoh's grandson, as the heir to the throne. Now, at this age of having reached adulthood, we're told he goes out to observe his own people. He hasn't forgotten who he is. He hasn't forgotten. Now, we may want to think of this, we probably would think of this at the terms of he was 20, 25. In Acts chapter 7, in Stephen's account of the history of this incident, He says that Moses was 40 years old when this happened. So if he was 40 years old, it means he's been some 37 years or so in the Pharaoh's palace. But he still hasn't forgotten who he is. The teachings of those early 3 years. Now, those teachings of those early 3 years has reminded him that he's a Hebrew, and he still identifies with these people. That is a remarkable thing, that he still identifies with these people, even though he's had all these many years, raised in the palace, educated in the palace, treated as royalty. He goes out to see his own people. He went out to where his own people were, which means he had to go to a distance, had to go out of town to see where the Israelites were living. And he watched their hard labor. He noticed that by this time they were slaves. By this time they were being severely oppressed, remember. And he goes out to watch them, and he is moved by the fact that they're working so hard and being treated so poorly. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He saw and was moved with emotion. This idea of this isn't fair. Well, they were slaves. And after all, the Egyptians should be able to do whatever they wanted to with these Hebrews because they weren't Egyptian. They were captives. They were slaves. And one from the palace should be approving of that. But he doesn't. He is moved with emotion. He looks around. He knows that to intervene is going to be wrong. This idea of looking back and forth suggests guilty conscience in the courtroom. That is, he knew what he was going to do was not legally the right thing to do. He looks around, and when he thinks no one is watching, he kills the Egyptian. He kills that one who is mistreating the Hebrew. And then he buries his body in the sand so that nobody will know, hoping to get away with it. The fact he is coming out of the palace after all these many years, still identifying with the Hebrews, and would go so far as to take this act, which is significant, knowing to be violation of the law. He does this because he's moved with such emotion for the Hebrew. Well, the next day, he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" So he hasn't gone back to the palace now and abandoned his people. He goes back out to see his people again, and this time you have one Hebrew attacking another Hebrew. He intervenes. In other words, one of them was attacking the other one wrongfully. He intervenes and goes to the one who is in the wrong and says, "What are you doing?" And the man's response is a surprise to Moses. The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Now, it would seem, it doesn't say so, but it would seem that Moses would be identified as the grandson of the Pharaoh. It would seem that Moses would be identified by the Hebrews as one of them, the other people, the Egyptians, the enemy. It would seem that he was royalty, and this Hebrew would not have been so smart-mouthed with him. But the Hebrew just looked at him and said, "Who made you ruler? If you're an Egyptian and you have royalty, go back and be royal in the palace. Who made you ruler over me? Who made you judge?" And then he says, "Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian?" Now Moses thought he'd gotten away with it. He had looked around, nobody saw, he buried the body. Well, there was somebody that knew. The Hebrew that he had saved from the beating, he would have known. And evidently, he went and told the other Hebrews what Moses had done. That guy from the palace, the Pharaoh's son, he killed this Egyptian. Now, This Hebrew, who is in the wrong, he knows what Moses did, and he brings it up to him. What are you going to? Who made you ruler? Who made you judge? Are you going to kill me just like you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid. He now realized others knew. And if the Hebrews knew, very likely the Egyptians knew. And if the Egyptians knew, it meant that he was in trouble, because he has killed an Egyptian to save a Hebrew. Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. Now, all probability, somewhere along the way, Pharaoh had to realize that Moses was born a Hebrew. Somewhere along the line, Pharaoh had to realize all this. But for all these many years, he's been living and trained and a part of the family. Now he realizes that this one that he thought was his adopted son, who he thought had adopted his way of thinking, now he realizes he is no longer to be trusted. And so the Pharaoh decides he needs to kill Moses. So Moses fled from the Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. In that day, Midian described the area on both of the east and the west side of the Reed Sea. That is the land that is today both Saudi Arabia on the east side and Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula on the west side. Okay? This was an area, unlike the land along the Nile, this was an area that was very dry and a wilderness. Now, we're not real sure why he went to Midian in the humanness. We're not told what it was that caused him to flee to Midian, except he was trying to get away from the Pharaoh. It may have been he knew that the inhabitants in Midian were not friendly with the Pharaoh. If the Pharaoh came looking for him, it may knew that they would not necessarily agree to turn him back over to the Pharaoh. So he goes to Midian. He's over there, and I said, very dry, much like a wilderness, but there are wells from place to place, and he finds one particular well, and he sits down to take up temporary residence. Now, in that day and time, people in that area would keep sheep, and it wasn't uncommon for the daughters of the family to be the shepherds, for them to take the sheep out and care for them. What happens in this encounter is, he says, when he fled, went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along, drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered the flock. 7 daughters of a Midianite priest. The Midianites, we think, were descendants of Abraham by Keturah, his second wife. After Sarai died, he married again, had more children, and it's believed that the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through this second wife. Now, the father's name, we're told later on, is Reuel, R-E-U-E-L. And Reuel means friend of God. And E-L in the name, which would be the word God, friend of God, is Elohim, the name of the God of Abraham. Okay? So it's thought that he was a priest of Midian, meaning that he was worshiping Abraham's God. He was a descendant of Abraham, and it may mean that he was a worshiper of Abraham's God. which would mean fleeing to Midian then would be a real plus, because now we have someone who has a similar background, that he would be sympathetic. So Moses goes, sitting there at the well. The daughters come up. They bring the water into the troughs. They dip the water out, pour it into the troughs to water their sheep. And these shepherds come up, run the seven girls run their sheep off so they can water their own. Moses gets up and intervenes on behalf of these seven daughters, running off these other shepherds and allowing these seven girls to water their flock. When the girls returned to Ruel, there's their father, the priest and the Midianite priest, their father asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" Normally what they would have to do is go out there to water their flock. The shepherds would come up. They would just have to sit contently till the other shepherds watered their flocks, and then once they left, the girls would be able to water their sheep. Today, however, they're back early because Moses has helped them water their sheep with the first water that was drawn into the troughs. They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He not only drove the shepherds away, the other shepherds away, but he intervened, but he also drew water out and helped us get water into the troughs for our sheep. "And where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man. So they go and get him. They go and invite him to come in. Moses agreed to stay with the man. We're reading there in verse 21. Our lesson drops down to verse 23. During that long period, in other words, Moses agrees to stay with this man. The man even gives him one of his daughters as a wife. And Moses stays with him in verse 23 for a long period. For a long period. We don't know how long a long period is. During that long period, though, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So here is Moses living in Midian for this long period of time. We're going to learn probably 40 years. While he is there for that 40 years, the king dies, and Pharaoh dies, the king of Egypt dies. And there becomes even more intense oppression, and there becomes more suffering. And the children of Israel cry out, and God hears their cry and is concerned about them. And thus, with verse 25, we end chapter 2, and we end this lesson laying the groundwork for the next lesson. Now, I said at the outset, this lesson is entitled, God Plans Deliverance. And we can see this very clearly demonstrated by the details that we've looked at today. He promised Abraham that his descendants would go into another place, be enslaved, and after 400 years would be delivered. That promise to Abraham was about 600 years before the birth of Moses. God's plan is unfolding. It's just 600 years later. But his plan was still in operation. Jochebed's faith. The fact that these Levites had kept their faith, they had kept their identity, and they knew of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And out of faith, when that child was born, maternal instincts, yes, but out of faith in those promises that they had been taught, They believed this child was no ordinary child, and they put him in the basket. Out of faith, they believed that Pharaoh's daughter would take him and raise him. This was all a plan that goes beyond the humanness, all that goes beyond the humanness. By God's plan, Moses is taught those first 3 or 4 years of his life what it is to be a Hebrew, and then receives all of that practical education, the finest education the world had to offer that day, in the Pharaoh's courts. And then he goes to Midian, where he lives a whole different lifestyle. All of this is preparing him for the deliverance, the role in the deliverance that he's going to play. God planned a deliverance, and we've seen that planning coming to fruition in this lesson, and we'll pick up here with the next lesson. But the point we want to make is God has a plan. He has a plan for your deliverance and mine. And it is whether we respond in that faith to believe that he has a plan. Do we have the faith to believe that he is faithful? A Levite man, a Levite woman, indicating that they understood who their God is and that he is a faithful God. And he made those promises to Abraham, and that he is a faithful God and will keep those plans, keep that plan, keep that promise. God has made a promise to us. He has made a promise to us that he will protect us, he will keep us, he will equip us, he will enable us. Do we have the faith to believe that he has a plan for our deliverance? Can we put our faith in him and respond as he would lead? Most unusual thing in the world would be to expect the Pharaoh's daughter to become involved. But evidently God placed that in Jochebed's mind, and the plan unfolded. God has a plan. God is faithful to keep his promise. He's promised us he has a plan for our deliverance. Let's respond in faith. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your love for us, for your faithfulness in keeping your promises. And as we look at this plan of deliverance, our faith grows because we recognize, yes, you are a faithful God who keeps your promises. And it is in our confidence in your faithfulness we commit ourselves into your hands and pray as you taught us to pray. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. May our faith grow. As the Father said, I believe, help my unbelief. This week we commit ourselves into your hands and ask that you would work in us and through us to accomplish your will. For it's in Jesus' name we pray.